Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and detailed Ororon guide. Ororon is the newest 4-star in Genshin Impact, released in version 5.2, and today we're going to cover everything you need to know about him. We're going to talk about Ororon's best builds, artifacts, weapons, teams, constellations, playstyle, and more, as well as including a full C0 showcase at the end of the video. Before we begin though, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested. Oh, and also excuse the slightly different audio from usual. I'm recording this guide in a remote setup, but without further ado, let's talk about Ororon. Alright, so starting things off, what does Ororon actually do? Firstly, Ororon's elemental skill is a very straightforward one where he shoots out an electro orb, dealing electro damage and bouncing between enemies. It'll hit one enemy and then bounce up to 3 times, dealing 1 instance of electro damage per enemy. It's a pretty straightforward ability. He just throws out a ball that'll bounce around up to 3 times, hitting each enemy once. For Ororon's elemental burst, however, this is an ability that'll taunt enemies and constantly spin around, dealing AoE electro damage. The taunt that this ability has is quite convenient, but for the most part, it's there to constantly deal out electro damage while constantly reapplying the electro element throughout its duration. In fact, this ability lasts for 9 seconds on a 15-second cooldown, so there's some downtime there, with it having an energy cost of 60. Do note that your burst will start by dealing a bigger hit of electro damage, and then some smaller hits through the waves that are being fired out by this rotating ball that is your ultimate. Now, outside of his relatively straightforward abilities, the central part of Ororon's kit is actually his first ascension passive. In fact, this passive has 2 parts. Firstly, as a Night Soul burst is triggered, Ororon will gain 40 Night Soul points. What a Night Soul burst is, in case you're wondering, is just something that triggers when you deal damage and you have at least one character from that land in your party. You'll see sort of white outline animation that'll indicate that you've triggered a Night Soul burst, just something that'll happen passively as you deal damage and not something you have to worry about. And so when you do trigger this Night Soul burst, Ororon will gain 40 Night Soul points, and then afterwards, within 15 seconds of using his skill, whenever other party members hit enemies with hydro or electro attacks, Ororon will gain 5 Night Soul points, up to a maximum of 10 times. Ororon can gain 80 Night Soul points maximum, and what he does with these Night Soul points is effectively convert them into damage. In fact, when nearby opponents are taking electro-charged reaction damage or Night Soul aligned damage by other characters than Ororon himself, he will consume 10 Night Soul points, entering the Night Soul blessing state, and deal Night Soul aligned electro damage, scaling with his attack to up to 4 nearby opponents. This can be triggered up to once every 1.8 seconds, and so what you need to know through this sort of wall of text is that Ororon's a character who naturally will synergize very well and get the full benefit of his kit through the electro-charged reaction primarily. Now, while you still get a lot of benefits by running a Nat Land carry who's doing Night Soul damage, thinking of Chaska for example, who not only will do Night Soul aligned damage but also hydro and electro damage provided you have characters of those elements in your party, Ororon's clearly a character designed around electro-charging and is someone whose main damage will come through his passive. Now, for Ororon's second passive, here he'll have an effect that will give the active party member and Ororon as well if he's off field a passive 9 energy each as the active character does normal, charge, or plunge attacks after Ororon uses his skill. This is a buff that triggers after his skill is cast, meaning that you typically want to use it at the start of your rotation to really get things going. Overall, before we talk about my thoughts on this character and how you should play him in a bit more depth, for his talent priority, note that you should maximize your elemental burst first and then your elemental skill. And you can ignore his normal attacks unless you want to make him a charge-shotting main DPS, which is not recommended. In fact, to talk about it very briefly, Ororon is a character who does have a very unique aim shot. He can float in the air. He also has Night Soul transmission in Natland, so you can kind of float around and explore Natland pretty efficiently with him. You can hold the jump button to float up a bit and regain some stamina. You can aim in midair, shoot some cool electro-charge attacks, which I genuinely do like the animation of, but the problem is that the damage scaling is really not great. He's not someone who should be charge attacking, so while it can be cool or fun, it's not recommended and not what we're going to be talking about because Ororon is primarily a support character and a strong one at that. Alright, now to give a bit more advanced information on Ororon and my thoughts on him, here's what I want to say. Firstly, while I did spend a decent amount of time talking about his Ascension 1 passive, it is worth pointing out this is where a big chunk of his damage will come, and so you want to be playing Ororon with other Hydro and Electro characters, typically at least another Hydro one, to trigger Electro Charge and allow him to trigger his passive as often as possible. Keep in mind that Night Soul aligned damage can also allow him to trigger it, allow him to consume Night Soul points and convert them to damage, but he will still need, in order to get the Night Soul points, outside of just the 40 that he gets from a Night Soul burst, other party members dealing Hydro or Electro damage. This means you want someone else to either be Hydro or Electro, or at least deal damage of that type, which, for example, Chaska can, even if there's no other Hydro or Electro, through her Electro-infused bullets from Ororon's presence in the party. Generally, though, you'll need either a Natland carry, as well as another source of Hydro or Electro damage, or just both Hydro and Electro, hero to trigger electro-charge to allow him to fully maximize his damage. This isn't something that needs to be overcomplicated. I'm just trying to be exhaustive here, but basically he just synergizes with electro-charge. A big thing that I haven't mentioned yet about why Ororon can be a good support is the fact that he is from Natlan, so he can run the incredibly powerful Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City set, which gives huge elemental buffs to your party and can make him a great option through that set in many teams. Ororon's gameplay is relatively straightforward. You want to use your skill at the start of your rotation to enable the buffs in your kit and using your burst to deal some damage and taunt enemies. One of Ororon's strengths is the fact that he is very AoE. He's good at dealing with multiple enemies, and as far as his comparison with Fischl is concerned, because a lot of people are going to ask that given that they're both Electro 4-star bow users, I do want to say that Ororon is a character who definitely doesn't replace her. Fischl is still a pretty broken character because she does offer so much elemental application, single target damage, and energy generation. Ororon gives you something else, which I think is very much appreciated and serves a different role to Fischl. In fact, while Fischl will generate more energy and apply more electro, Ororon, while he still does apply electro and generate some energy for your team, he primarily will shine more in AoE, where he will be able to damage multiple enemies at once, whereas someone like Fischl is more single target. Additionally, Ororon allows you to run the hero set as mentioned earlier, which is a really powerful set, giving your overall team a ton of damage if you don't already have it on someone else. Additionally, Ororon can give your active party members some attack through his 6th constellation, but more on that later, although even at C0 at a baseline, Ororon's kit does genuinely feel complete. He doesn't feel like someone who needs a constellation as some other niche supports kind of do. He's solid, has good AoE damage, elemental application, he can taunt enemies and give you buffs through his artifacts and weapon, and is someone that I am genuinely pretty happy with. He's just another solid electro damage dealing support or sub DPS who is designed around the electro-charged reaction, which is one that got buffed in the last patch. For those of you wondering, electro-charge does do a decent amount more damage now, and he can fit many different teams even if they're not fully centered around electro-charged. An advantage and something I also wanted to mention about Ororon is that while his damage is nice, especially with constellations like his first one, even without it, he can be a solid, low investment support who through the hero set and maybe a supportive weapon can already provide you with enough value on your team to be a viable 4-star even without needing the most investment. Now obviously you should still invest into him, give him damage, and build him properly, which we will cover in this video, but I do want to mention that even at a baseline, his supportive capabilities can make him viable because of how strong the hero set is. Alright, now moving on to talk about Ororon's best builds, here's what you need to know. Firstly, for his artifact sets, it is very straightforward. You absolutely want to go for the Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City set because it's just way too broken as a supportive set. This is a set that gives you 6 energy when a Night Soul Burst is triggered to Ororon himself, and then on the 4-piece, it will give a 40% elemental damage bonus to any element involved in a reaction that you're triggering. This will not only be incredibly useful for all of your party members that are buffed by any electro reaction that Ororon is triggering, but also for Ororon himself who can make use of this damage bonus. Keep in mind that you can buff multiple elements at once, meaning that if you trigger electro-charge, all of your party members will gain 40% electro damage bonus and 40% hydro damage bonus, which is just really good. For those reasons, the hero set is the undisputed best in slot and what I recommend for Ororon almost always. The main exception would be if you already have someone in your team who has this set, although usually you're gonna be wanting to run Ororon in a team where he's the one on the hero set. It's part of his appeal, part of why he can be strong, because not only does he have damage, but he also has access to this really strong buffing set. With that in mind, if someone else is on it or you don't want to use it, you can go for stats. You can mix and match 2 pieces or run the Gilded Dreams 4-piece for some attack and EM, or you could even go Noblesse Oblige if you want to give your team an attack buff. Also, regarding the Obsidian Codex set, this can be your best for personal damage if you are on field, giving you damage bonus and 40% crit rate. Keep in mind that this set will only give you these buffs when you're on field, so this is only really recommended if you want to spend time on your Ororon, making him your on-fielder in the team. Typically though, this isn't recommended. While the Obsidian Codex set would give you a lot of personal damage, the hero set just gives you too much team DPS through the 40% elemental damage bonus you're gaining to multiple different elements. Now moving on for the stats you want on Ororon, once again, it should be relatively straightforward. Firstly, crit rate and crit damage are important to maximize your Ororon's damage. Attack percent is great as well, and regarding elemental mastery, well, here's what you should know. While it can be useful as they did buff the electro-charge reaction and it does do a decent amount of damage, the thing about electro-charge as a reaction is that it's nice to trigger it, but it's really hard to build around it. This is because who is triggering electro-charge in your team can be very inconsistent. If you're running a hydro and an electro unit, or maybe even multiple of one or the other, the electro-charge reactions will be triggered by kind of all of the characters, depending on your rotation, the enemies, and just a lot of factors, making it to where building elemental mastery to maximize your electro-charged damage is not recommended, and typically you want to be focusing on crit and attack to get more value, focusing on your Ororon scalings and not on his electro-charged damage. You want to trigger the reaction, but you're not trying to build towards maximizing your reaction's damage. Now, with that said, Elemental Mastery as a substat here and there is still appreciated. It still will buff the electro-charges that you trigger, it's fine, but it's not your main priority and not what you should be building around. With that said, something you do want on Ororon is enough energy recharge to use your burst on cooldown. Now, in some teams, this can be a very low amount, and in some teams, it can be a higher one. In fact, if you're running a double electro team, especially with a battery like Raiden Shogun, Yai Miko, or Fischl, you can need a small amount of energy recharge, anywhere from just 100 to 120, whereas in a solo electro team, you may need a lot more, ranging anywhere from around 150 to 180. Keep in mind that the exact amount of energy you need will vary heavily based on the team you're running, and also if you have Favonius weapons in your team. And it is useful to note though that even if you're short on energy, you can still fully buff your team by using your skill and equipping the hero set, but you still want to use your burst as often as possible, as it is a core part of your kit and damage, so be sure to build enough energy recharge. And so for those reasons, those are the substats you're looking for on your pieces: crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, and as much energy recharge as you need. For your main stats, you're looking for attack percent or energy recharge on your sands if you need it, electro damage bonus on your goblet, and a crit rate or crit damage circlet, trying to balance your crit rate to crit damage ratio as much as possible. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about Ororon's best weapons and which one you should use. Keep in mind that for the coming sections, my mic may sound different as I'm in a new location because I don't want to delay this guide any longer. With that in mind, what weapons should you use on Ororon? Well, you'll be happy to hear that Ororon's a character who can use almost any weapon. As a character who can make use of almost any stat, like genuinely any generic stat stick that gives you crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, or even energy recharge can all be really strong for Ororon. You can use offensive options or supportive options, and even Elemental Mastery is not a wasted stat, even though it's not the main thing you're looking for. For those reasons, generally for Ororon, any solid stat stick will work. Firstly, as far as supportive weapons go, the Elegy for the End will be your best overall team option. This is a weapon that will give you energy recharge and then increase your team's Elemental Mastery and attack by a decent amount after you deal damage with Ororon's skill or burst. This is a very easy effect to proc, it'll give you energy recharge to use your burst, and it'll buff your team at the cost of some of Ororon's personal damage. Obviously, he'll do a bit less, his team will do a lot more, so usually it's a worthwhile trade-off, especially if your team is triggering reactions and can make use of both the Elemental Mastery and attack buffs. For those reasons, Elegy for the End is highly recommended, and as far as supportive options go, the only other supportive bow you can use is Favonius if you want to give your team some more energy. This is a bow that has a ton of ER, and then will give your team energy as you crit on Ororon. Once again, you'll lose out on some personal damage, but it can help give your team more energy, allowing them to build more offensive stats and less ER, on top of making your Ororon need a lot less energy recharge himself. The energy you're gaining can be so beneficial to your team that it can be better than some stat sticks for Ororon, just because the supportive capability can grant you higher team DPS on top of giving you energy recharge. So the Fav bow can be a great 4-star, even better than some 5-stars if your team needs the energy, and you can make use of it, so a great 4-star to keep in mind. You also get one Favonius bow from a quest, so it is technically a free-to-play option, and the energy recharge definitely helps out Ororon as well, especially at low constellation. With that in mind, you don't need to run a purely supportive weapon on him either. While both Favonius and Elegy are great, and I believe Elegy is usually the best overall for your team's damage if you can make use of it, there are some amazing other stat sticks. Firstly, any 5-star weapon that gives you crit is just great. Polar Star, giving you a ton of crit rate as well as some damage and attack percent, is an incredible 5-star that you should use if you have it, as well as the others such as Hunter's Path, the First Great Magic, Aqua Simulacra, Thundering Pulse, or Skyward Harp. You could even use Chaska's bow if you have it and want to use it on someone. All of these weapons give you basically just a lot of stats, usually being a ton of crit with some attack and maybe damage percent as well. All of them rank relatively similarly depending on what stats you need more of, with Chaska's bow being slightly worse than the others but still good. All of the 5-star stat sticks are just amazing. And so any 5-star stat stick can work, but if you don't have any, then fear not, because there are a lot of great 4-star options you can use. Firstly, the Chain Breaker, which is the new Natlan free-to-play craftable weapon, is a great option you can use. You can craft this weapon and get it to R5 for free, and with that you get a ton of stats. In fact, it comes with a high base attack and some attack percent, and then an effect that will give you 9.6% attack for every party member from Natlan or who has a different elemental type than Ororon, and if you have 3 stacks, then you will also gain 48 elemental mastery at R5. These are all a ton of useful stats that Ororon can make use of, making it your best free-to-play option and also one of your best 4-stars, being just a great choice for this character, provided you can stack its effect, which you should very easily be able to do in almost all of his teams. Outside of that, you can also use other high refinement 4-star options such as Alley Hunter, Range Gauge, Fading Twilight, or even just another bow like Verdescent Hunt. Outside of that, if you're looking for another free-to-play option, Song of Stillness can work as well for a ton of damage, provided that you can trigger its effect, meaning that you get healed on your Ororon, which typically is the case mainly if you're playing Farina to drain some of your HP and then heal it back up, or if you're running a healer that will overheal you. And so overall, there really are a ton of options. On screen now, I'm going to put a rough ranking of a lot of different weapons and different priority levels of like which ones you should choose. Keep in mind that there are so many options that are great and similar in strength to where any good stat stick can be chosen. Almost every 5-star bow is great, as well as a ton of 4-star stat sticks and even a great free-to-play 4-star bow with the Chainbreaker that Ororon has access to. Because of this, everyone can have a good weapon on Ororon. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about Ororon's constellations and how good they are. Firstly, Ororon C1 is one of his best for his personal damage. This one will allow his skill to bounce 2 additional times, and on top of that, once your skill hits an opponent, it will apply an effect that will make them take 50% increased damage from his first passive talent, which is a big chunk of his damage. This effect will last for 12 seconds, and your skill only has a 15-second cooldown, so the uptime's pretty good, and it will make enemies take just a lot more damage from your Ororon, being a great early constellation for his damage. Next up, Ororon C2 will give him electro damage bonus as enemies take damage by his burst, starting at 8% and ramping up to 32%, being another nice passive increase to his personal damage. Next up, C3 and 5 increases talent levels, with C3 increasing his burst talent level, being pretty nice, and then C4 will give him a bit more energy after using his burst, on top of making it spin faster. Lastly, for Ororon C6, here is the best one overall to buff your team, provided you're running an attack scaling character. In fact, as you trigger Ororon's first passive, your active character will gain 10% attack for 9 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. This means that your on-field character will gain up to 30% attack as they are just on-field. Because of this makes Ororon a pretty solid buffer on top of what he already has. It gives him another source of attack percent on top of being able to run the hero set and have pretty good damage. It's another reason to run him in your teams, provided you're running an attack scaling character. Make it a nice bonus that's slapped onto your last constellation. On top of that, it gives Ororon one trigger of his Ascension 1 passive, Hypersense, that'll deal 200% of its original damage when he uses his burst. Overall, it's a nice constellation, a nice buff to an attack scaling character, but also not a needed one. It's really nice. It's great that Ororon's constellations, notably his C1, C6, and also some other ones along the way like C2, are nice increases to his personal damage and also a decent attack buff with his C6, but he's not a character that absolutely is dependent on constellations like I'd say that some other niche supports are. Alright, now moving on, let's get into one of the most important sections, which is revolving Ororon's best teams. Now, as I've mentioned throughout the video, Ororon's a character who naturally revolves around the electro-charged reaction. Typically, you want to run him with at least one Hydro party member in a team that at least triggers electro-charge, or that's running a Night Soul aligned Natlan carry. If you are running him with just a Natlan carry, even though you won't need to be triggering electro-charge for the second part of his first passive, you do at least want someone else who will deal Hydro or electro damage to help him gain more Night Soul points, as if not, you'll only trigger your first passive 4 times instead of 8. It still can be viable, but it'll just be worse, so keep that in mind. Outside of that criteria, Ororon can be ran as an electro support in virtually any of those teams, as he will apply electro, deal some damage, generate some energy, and also give you the hero set that will buff you greatly. Now, with that said, let's talk about some teams you can run with him. Firstly, any variation of a taser or electro-charged team with Ororon can work. You can run Ororon alongside a Hydro support, a Hydro off-fielder that is, like Xingqiu, Yelan, or Farina, running an on-field driver who can either apply more of an element or swirl it if it's an Anemo character, and then a flexible last slot, usually being another Electro or Hydro user. These teams are very flexible. There's a lot you can do. My personal favorite is running an Anemo on-fielder like Sucrose, but you can also run a Hydro or Electro one. Really, anything works. You can run Sucrose Taser, you can run Kokomi or Ayato Taser with a flexible last slot, anyone who will buff, deal damage, or swirl, or you could even run an Anemo carry like Wander. Additionally, Ororon can be ran alongside a solid Electro carry as well, with me personally liking him a lot in a Chlorind Electro-Charge team. This is a team that works because of how strong the supports are. You have Farina, an amazing off-field support and buffer, and then another buffer as the last slot, namely someone like Kazuha or Shilonen, both of which can be great here. Shilonen giving you some healing and buffs, Kazuha giving you buffs, grouping, and personal damage, so both can be good. On top of Chlorind, who has really good personal damage, it can also self-heal, which allows her to stack up Farina without needing a healer. I do believe that Chlorind has pretty good synergy with Ororon, as he can help buff Electro through the hero set, on top of being somewhat of a battery. Outside of that, generic Electro carries can work, and so can Hydro carries. While I mentioned some Hydro on-fielders earlier, I do also want to mention Neuvillette as a character who obviously is incredibly broken on his own. He doesn't need specific supports, but it is worth noting that outside of his like premium 5-star support options that obviously will perform the best, so use them if you have them. If you're
missing one, two, or multiple, then Ororon can actually be a good option. While obviously he's not Shilonen, if you don't have her or are missing a support for Neuvillette, Ororon can come in and not only apply Electro, which will count as an element in order to increase Neuvillette's charge attack scaling, but he'll also be able to buff both his Electro damage and Neuvillette's Hydro damage as well, on top of Farina's if you're running her there too, through the hero set, on top of triggering electro-charge, which will enable your Ororon to deal damage, making him just a solid 4-star option for Neuvillette teams, unironically. Outside of that, you can also run Ororon alongside Chaska. Obviously, I mentioned this in my Chaska guide, but Ororon works great with her. She can do both Hydro and Electro damage, on top of just Night Soul Align damage, triggering Ororon's passive, and Ororon also synergizes well with her, buffing different elements, and therefore buffing Chaska's different elemental bullets, making them just work well with one another, on top of both being on the same banner as well. Outside of Chaska, you can also use him alongside a lot of different generic carries if you're just running someone like Farina and a healer, as you're already triggering electro-charge that way. You can put someone like Navia in this team and it'll work just fine, and you can also run Ororon alongside any maybe future Natlan carry who wants to react with Electro. While it's kind of undetermined what this can be right now, if we have a carry who is from Natlan and deals Night Soul Align damage, then you can trigger Ororon's passive pretty reliably, enabling him to deal off-field damage, generate and consume Night Soul points, and then if it's an element that can react with Electro, well, Ororon can buff them with a hero set. Who knows, this might be the case for someone like Mawika, or maybe a future Electro or Hydro carry from Natlan. On a similar note, if we do get an Electro or Pyro carry from Natlan, you might be able to run them alongside Chevris and Ororon in a Chevy team where, while you won't be triggering electro-charge, you will have a Natlan DPS to enable Ororon's passive and get a ton of buffs from Chevy and also Ororon. Outside of that, the sky's the limit. Even characters I didn't mention like Yaimiko, Child, Baiju, or really whoever can be ran in a Taser team and electro-charge one alongside Ororon, and you can get decent value. He's a good 4-star for those teams, one that I like. He has somewhat of a niche, but it's a pretty big one. You just want to trigger electro-charge or have a Natlan carry that wants Electro and can react with it, then he will work. Keep in mind, I don't recommend him as much for Aggravate or Hyperbloom teams as I do with Taser, just because he's not really designed for that, and his burst also has some downtime, so if you're trying to build him for Hyperbloom, you don't have the most uptime compared to someone like Kuki, so that's why I didn't mention it. But for the most part, any team where you're running electro-charged and want someone running the hero set can be a great place for Ororon. Alright, now with that out of the way, I'm going to do what is traditional with more supportive 4-star characters, where instead of just putting a generic DPS showcase over music, because Ororon is going to be kind of just in the back buffing his teammates and doing some damage but not being like the central part of the team, just a nice addition. I'm gonna have some footage playing on screen as well as in previous parts of the video too, using some various teams, letting you see him in action, a C0 Ororon on Elegy and a hero set in some various electro-charged teams. I'm doing this also to not make the video too long, as it already has been delayed more than I had hoped. With that in mind, I do think, as mentioned, that Ororon is a solid and well-balanced 4-star unit. I don't think he's broken, but I do think he's good, and I'm happy that he exists. He's another good electro option you can use, who, as I said, also gets a lot of value at low investment on a purely supportive build. You really don't need to spend everything you have to make him good, but you could also invest into him to make him better and deal more damage. I like that he's centered around electro-charge without being super restricted to it, like there's a few other teams you can do, on top of having good constellations but not being dependent on them. With that in mind, I hope you enjoyed both the little showcase and also the guide. If there's anything you want to add or specify, it will be in a pinned comment, as Ororon is a new unit, so new things may be discovered. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you want to see next. Maybe a Neuvillette guide for his rerun, and then I assume Shilonen and Sitlali when they come out. So stay tuned for those. Feel free to subscribe and like if you're new, because a lot of effort went into this, so it's appreciated. And yeah, I'll stop talking. Thanks for watching. See you guys in the next one. Goodbye.